Good evening and welcome to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. I'm Katie Gilman, the Membership and Communications Coordinator here. So tonight we join Dan Schnur for the October Dan Schnur Political Report. And Dan's topic tonight is, will the 2024 election be decided on the campaign trail or in a courtroom? And we'll also be covering recent developments in the House and Senate. For those of you who would like to submit questions for Dan, there's a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen where you can type in your questions. Rachel Kenderdine and I will be managing your questions during the Q&A segment, which should start in about 30 minutes. In case you missed last month's program, we are trying out a new format for these monthly webinars. After Dan offers some initial analysis on the subject, Rachel and I will return to the screen and we'll ask deeper discussion questions. Then we will move to the audience Q&A segment at the usual 30-minute mark. So Dan, as always, we are so excited and looking forward to this program, so we'll turn it over to you.
Well, Katie, thank you so much. And as always, thanks all of you for being with us for tonight's discussion. As those of you who've been looking at our emails know, our original plan had been to focus primarily tonight on the various courtroom challenges that Donald Trump and Hunter Biden are facing. But as Katie referenced, the news of the week has caught up with us. And so while we will do our best to talk about the Trump and the Biden court cases and legal proceedings, we really do need to start tonight with two pieces of really, really big news. The first, of course, and this is where we'll begin the conversation, is with the vote by a small number of Republicans and Democrats to remove Speaker Kevin McCarthy from his position as the leader of the House of Representatives. And we'll talk about this for a few minutes, then go on to talk about the very sad passing of U.S. Senator Dianne Feinstein and the political complications that resulted for Governor Gavin Newsom of California and others before ultimately he named longtime labor leader LaFonza Butler to fill the unexpired portion of Senator Feinstein's term in Washington. And then at that point, we'll get to the legal proceedings, but if we don't get to spend as much time on that tonight, I think we can all make an educated guess that neither the Donald Trump or the Hunter Biden investigations are going away anytime soon. So if we don't get enough time on them tonight, we will certainly come back to them, if not next month, in the very near future. But let's talk about the very brief speakership of Kevin McCarthy. The controversy and ultimately the elimination of McCarthy as Speaker over the past several days had its roots back earlier this year when McCarthy was first elected Speaker of the House of Representatives after no fewer than 15 ballots before he finally was able to put together the votes in order to assume that office. For those of you with not only long memories, but who paid exceedingly close attention to proceedings, you may remember that McCarthy had a very, very difficult time convincing a relatively small group of conservative Republicans to support his candidacy. And that was one of the reasons it took so long for him to finally achieve the speakership. One of the key ways that McCarthy convinced those rebellious conservatives to vote for him or to abstain and to let the vote go through is he offered them a reform on what's known as a motion to vacate of the speakership. And in the past, it's required a certain number of votes from members in order to vacate the chair. McCarthy basically said to that small group of conservative rebels, he said, I will support a rule change that says if one single member of the House of Representatives wants to call for a vote on my speakership, that I will allow that to happen. And at the time, because McCarthy's ultimate victory was so noteworthy, not a lot of attention was paid to the conditions on which that victory was based until this past week or so, because as McCarthy was doing everything he could to pass a Republican-supported budget in the House of Representatives. A handful of those same conservative rebels were doing everything they could do to undermine his efforts. And McCarthy, after trying to pass a Republican budget several times and failing because he was not able to get a unanimous vote of his caucus, and keep in mind that Republicans only have a 5-vote margin in the House of Representatives. So McCarthy really couldn't afford to lose anything more than a small number of Republican votes. He wasn't able to pull it off no matter how many times he tried. And so finally, late last Friday night, he put together an alternative continuing resolution, which didn't really solve the budget crisis, but put off the day of reckoning for another several weeks. We put forth a continuing budget resolution that was not supported unanimously by Republicans, but was supported by almost every Democrat in the House of Representatives. So McCarthy essentially, in order to keep the government from shutting down last Saturday night at midnight, put forward a bill that was designed to attract support from both parties. Like I said, almost every Democrat voted for the bill. A majority of Republicans did. But that small number of conservative rebels were so angered that McCarthy passed a budget that they felt reflected Democratic priorities rather than their own, that one of their number, the representative from Florida who's become very famous this week, Representative Matt Gaetz, called for a vote on McCarthy's speakership. And while McCarthy was able to secure the votes of every Republican but 8 in a caucus of more than 200, because he only had that 5-vote margin, that wasn't enough. So here we now sit. McCarthy is not the Speaker of the House of Representatives. For all practical purposes, there is not a Speaker for the first time in the House's history. There is a representative from North Carolina, Patrick McHenry, who currently holds the title of Speaker Pro Tem, but it's not entirely clear what his authority is and if he can do anything in the House other than oversee votes for the next speaker. What McHenry has announced is that next Tuesday night, he will host a debate among the various candidates running for Speaker of the House, and next Wednesday they will vote. But at this point, in order to elect a speaker, the Republicans are going to need to come together behind a candidate, if not McCarthy, someone else. And at least at this point, it's not really clear, and in fact, it looks fairly doubtful, that any of the announced or almost announced candidates have that breadth of support. Now, of course, next Wednesday is almost a full week away, and a lot can happen between now and then. But right now, not only is the United States government operating on borrowed time with roughly 6 weeks to go before this new budget resolution runs out, but the House of Representatives does not have a leader, and hopefully will in the next 6 days, but that's not something we understand yet. So there's a lot going on here. And Rachel and Katie, I know you're going to join me back on screen. We can talk about this in a little bit more detail.
Yes, thanks, Dan. So this is obviously an historic moment. Kevin McCarthy went through a lot to get to the speakership to begin with. So is there anything he could have done to avoid being ousted?
Well, it's a really good question. And it's pretty clear that, as I said a moment ago, once McCarthy made that promise to those renegade Republicans that he would agree to a vote to allow him to be removed with only one House member supporting it, at that point, he could argue that even then he was living on borrowed time, because there are a small number of Republican House members. And again, it's a very small fraction of the caucus, but under these rules, it only takes one. But there's a handful of Republican House members who really despise McCarthy. And at any moment between January and, well, this week, they could have called on a vote on him, which is what Representative Gaetz did. So I don't think there was anything he could have done. McCarthy has spent the last several months trying to give conservative Republicans almost everything they want at every level of government, to the consternation not only of the Democratic House members, but of some of the more moderate, some of the more centrist Republican members of the House. And McCarthy's strategy seems to have been, if I give the conservatives everything they want, then I'll be able to keep my job. But as we learned this week, that was pretty unlikely. The one other way that McCarthy could have kept his job is he seemed to belatedly realize in the last hours before he was removed, is with Democratic votes. Because McCarthy knew that he was going to get an overwhelming majority of Republicans. Like I said, he got all but 8. That means he really only needed a few Democrats to vote for him to maintain his speaker's position. And in fact, there's reporting that a lot of the centrist Republicans in the so-called Problem Solvers Caucus in the House, a bipartisan group of more centrist members from both parties, that a lot of McCarthy's more moderate allies tried to convince some of their Democratic allies to vote for McCarthy in the interest of stability of the House of Representatives. But it was very clear from House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries on down that the Democrats were in no mood to save Kevin McCarthy. They don't feel like he's conducted himself in a trustworthy manner over the months. And even this past weekend, when it was very clear he was going to be forced to pass a continuing budget resolution with Democratic votes, McCarthy was still sticking his finger in the eye of a lot of House Democrats. On Saturday, when the vote was getting ready to proceed, Jeffries and the other Democrats asked if they could have another hour to review a very long, complicated budget before the vote. McCarthy said no. On Sunday morning, he went on television, shutdown having been averted, and blamed the Democrats for having caused the crisis. So McCarthy, by being such a strong partisan up until the very end, may have prohibited his opportunity to win over some Democratic votes to keep him in office. I don't think there's any way he could have ever kept Gates and the other renegade Republicans on board. But looking back at it, there are probably steps he could have taken to maintain his position with Democratic support. The problem with that is it would have alienated even more Republicans. And while it would have solved his immediate crisis, it would have created a new one going forward. So a very long way, Rachel, of answering, saying, I think McCarthy couldn't have kept his speakership under any circumstances with just Republican votes. He might have been able to do it with Democratic votes, but it would have created additional problems for him at that point.
So what implications will his removal have for the House and for both parties?
Well, at this point, we don't know. We do know, as I said earlier, that the country, our federal government, has roughly 6 weeks to pass a budget after the momentary reprieve that was voted on last weekend. And until there's a new Speaker of the House, it's very improbable that any significant work is going to get done on that budget. So that's one implication. But beyond that, it really depends on who the next Speaker of the House of Representatives turns out to be. Right now, there are 2 declared candidates. The House Majority Leader, McCarthy's number 2, Steve Scalise, has announced that he's running. And Jim Jordan, the representative from Ohio, who's the chair of the House Judiciary Committee, is running also. Both are more conservative than McCarthy. Scalise is considered to be more a part of the establishment, more of an institutionalist, whereas Jordan historically has been more of a rebel and more of a movement conservative. In either case, the House Republican caucus moves to the right. The question is how far, and we won't know that until the next Speaker is chosen, whether it's one of these 2 men or someone else. Now, as I think all of you know, even with our new format, one thing we definitely want to preserve from our old way of doing things is the poll questions that we put to all of you. So we didn't forget about that. But if one of you can put up the first poll question for our group, that would be great. So based on what we've just talked about, and based on what all of you, of course, have been reading and thinking about, the question is a pretty simple one. The debate for House Speaker is next Tuesday night. The vote for House Speaker is next Wednesday. The question for all of you is, will the House elect a new Speaker next week? Yes, will Jordan or Scalise or someone else be elected, and the business of government will continue in some way or other? Or no, then simply 6 days isn't enough to breach these divisions within the Republican Party, and it's going to take longer. And of course, you always have the out of saying, "Don't know, Dan. You try to tell me, and I'll see what I think." So, what did we get for our responses, guys? Oh, look at that! Factoring out the 27% don't know, which I will note is an unusually high number for our group. Our group is very well read and very well informed, and generally very certain of their opinions. So the fact that more than a quarter of our group says don't know, I think if anything underscores what a murky situation this is. But of what's left, by almost a 2-to-1 margin, our group says no, this is not going to be settled by next Wednesday or by next week. The one other thing I point out before we go on this, one thing to keep an eye on as you watch to see whether Jordan or Scalise or another candidate is able to secure the votes to become speaker, is that as conservative as the House Republican caucus has become, McCarthy is a more conservative leader than his predecessors, John Boehner or Paul Ryan. And as I said earlier, Steve Scalise and Jim Jordan would both be even more conservative than McCarthy. But here's what you need to remember. While the contenders to become speaker are fighting for the large number of conservative votes that dominate the Republican caucus, there are 18 Republicans in the House of Representatives who represent districts that Joe Biden carried in 2020. And those so-called frontline Republicans have been keeping their mouths shut for most of the year. As McCarthy has been trying to give the conservatives what they want, these frontline Republicans realize that in order to win a district that Biden carried, they have to find a way to move to the center. And even though they haven't been entirely comfortable with a lot of the actions the House has taken, they pretty much kept to their own counsel. Well, that's not the case anymore. And these 18 members have made it very clear that they're not going to vote for anyone for speaker who they think moves the caucus even further in an unacceptably conservative direction. So the challenge for Scalise or for Jordan or for any other Republican is, how do you win over that remaining cohort of centrist Republicans? Because without them, by definition, you don't have enough votes to hold the job. And although I don't like to make predictions, as all of you know, I think I'll stick with the majority of our group on this one, which is that for an individual to figure out how to win over all those conservative Republicans and that small group of centrists, that might take more than a few days.
So all of this really started because of the potential for a government shutdown. The continuing resolution passed by Congress this weekend to avoid the shutdown didn't include funding for the war in Ukraine. So what does this mean for U.S. support in Ukraine moving forward?
Okay. Rachel, I'm so glad you raised that, because we did sort of skate through the continuing resolution itself in order to focus on the speakership fight. But while there were many issues that separated the two parties in Congress on passing a budget and keeping the government open, funding for the war in Ukraine is probably the most important and almost certainly the most divisive. What's worth noting now is that Jim Jordan, the Judicial Committee chair, who, as I mentioned, is the more conservative of these two candidates, has for the last several months been a very outspoken opponent of the U.S. continuing to fund the war in Ukraine. Scalise has voted against funding, but he's been somewhat more equivocal on it. Once again, conservative, but probably not as conservative. McCarthy has been walking a very fine line on this for several months, as he has been on so many other issues, not wanting to get on the wrong side of the majority of the members of his caucus who now do oppose increases in funding. But also, it appears that McCarthy himself recognized that it was important to continue to support Ukraine. So he's been trying to walk a very fine line. It doesn't appear that either Scalise or Jordan is interested in anywhere near that nuanced position. So my immediate thought is that whoever takes over as the Republican speaker is going to be much more adamant in their opposition to Ukraine funding. Now, to be clear, that doesn't mean that they won't support it. It means that their conditions for supporting it are going to be much greater. And in particular, one issue that's arisen in both the House and more recently and more notably in the Senate in recent days is a question of additional funding for the US-Mexico border. Now, Republicans, of course, have been criticizing Biden from day one for not emphasizing border security in the way that they think would be helpful. But as more and more leading Democrats, Eric Adams of New York, J.B. Pritzker of Illinois, the House Speaker in the state of Massachusetts, as more and more local and state Democrats begin to voice their displeasure with the influx of migrants into their communities, the Biden administration is clearly feeling the political heat. And for those of you who didn't see it today, Biden today authorized money to be spent to resume construction of the border wall. And also the Biden administration this afternoon implemented a much more, I'd say a much harsher policy toward undocumented migrants from Venezuela, and the likelihood of them those migrants being able to stay in this country is now much lower. So there's already a lot of pressure on the Biden administration from Republicans, of course, but also from many Democrats to take more aggressive steps on the immigration issue. And what I suspect may happen is that you see the Democrats in Congress, in both the House and the Senate, signing on to perhaps stricter or harsher restrictions on migration into this international migration into the US in exchange for additional money for Ukraine. There are a lot of members of both parties who believe that Ukraine needs to be funded and that that's of absolute urgency. But they also note that it'd be very, very difficult for them to defend themselves on the campaign trail from charges that Representative X or Senator Y cares more about Ukraine than they do about our own country. So not only do we have a real world crisis impacting this decision, but certainly as well the upcoming midterm elections. Now, we could probably spend not just the rest of this hour, but probably several hours after it, continuing to talk about the federal budget, about the fight for speaker and other related issues, Ukraine among them. But we do have a lot of other ground to cover. And I really do want to make sure that we spend at least a few minutes tonight talking not only about Senator Feinstein's passing, but not only Governor Newsom's appointment of LaFonza Butler to fill her vacancy, but also about some of the strategic thinking and political machinations that went into Newsom's selection. Now, as most of you remember, and we've talked about this on the webinar previously, is 2 years ago, shortly after Newsom named then Secretary of State Alex Padilla to replace Kamala Harris in the US Senate when Harris was sworn in as vice president, Newsom faced a lot of criticism from the state's African-American community, pointing out that Harris was only one of 2 Black women ever to serve in the United States Senate, and they were upset that he appointed someone else. Even though Padilla became the state's first Latino senator, they were upset that Newsom did not replace Harris with another Black woman. So in a television interview in 2021, Newsom pledged that if Feinstein was unable to finish her term, that he would appoint a Black woman to serve in her place. Now, the immediate controversy or the immediate dust-up was Feinstein, who was none too happy at that point because she didn't enjoy the governor of her state speculating on national television about her potential death or incapacitation. But once that got settled, it became clear that Newsom had made that promise, confident that if Feinstein was unable to complete her term for whatever reason, that he had two very attractive candidates from whom to choose. One being Representative Barbara Lee from the Bay Area, from the the Oakland-Berkeley region, and second, Karen Bass, who's then U.S. representative from Los Angeles. Now, as all of you know, Bass ran for and got elected mayor of Los Angeles, and she's been in that job for less than a year, so she's not going anywhere. But in the subsequent 2 years, Representative Lee decided to become a candidate for Senate herself. And all of a sudden, Newsom began facing a huge amount of pressure from Lee's opponents, Representative Katie Porter and Representative Adam Schiff, not to appoint Lee to the Senate because it would give her such an advantage in the 2024 campaign. So a few weeks ago, Newsom said that he would appoint only someone who did not intend to run for re-election. He did not use the term, but essentially he'd only appoint a caretaker. And once again, he faced very harsh criticism from many African-American community leaders in California, saying that by disqualifying Lee in that regard, he was not only showing her disrespect, but showing the entire community great disrespect. So just last Sunday, Newsom's office put out a statement clarifying, saying that Newsom, in fact, would not make that a prerequisite. And just a few hours later, it became public that LaFonza Butler, who is currently the president of Emily's List, the Democratic fundraising organization that raises money for pro-choice and primarily pro-choice female candidates, and former labor leader here in California, that he had appointed Butler, or was going to appoint Butler to Feinstein's seat. So now we have a situation where Adam Schiff and Katie Porter and Barbara Lee are all running for Senate. Brand new Senator LaFonza Butler has not said whether she's running or not. But from Newsom's perspective, he's off the hook, because since he didn't make that a condition for Butler's appointment, if she decides to run, that's her decision, not his. So all that said, California, after having had two senators, Barbara Boxer and Dianne Feinstein, served together for almost a quarter of a century, and after Kamala Harris moved on to the vice presidency, we now have two senators who've both taken office by appointment. Alex Padilla just 2 years ago, and LaFonza Butler earlier this week. So just as Jerry Brown's leaving the governor's office paved the way for Gavin Newsom, we're now seeing a new era in the California congressional delegation as well, with not just Feinstein's passing and Boxer's retirement a few years back, Nancy Pelosi stepping down as speaker, Kevin McCarthy being forced out. This really is a generational change in California politics, both here and in Washington, and is worth a longer conversation than I suspect that we can have today.
Yeah, and so Dan, you just touched on this a little bit, and thank you for explaining all of this right now. But why do you think Governor Newsom appointed LaFonza Butler?
No, this is not meant as a criticism of Senator Butler at all. But if you assume that Newsom was going to keep his word, which is worth assuming that he was going to appoint a Black woman, there are many qualified Black women in elected office and in the private nonprofit sectors around the state of California. I don't know that Butler is a significantly superior or inferior choice in terms of quality of her ability to serve. But as I mentioned earlier, Newsom was in a bit of a pickle of his own making by saying that he was not going to appoint somebody who would run for another term. And so a lot of the more likely candidates, LA County Supervisor Holly Mitchell, London Breed, the mayor of San Francisco, Representative Sidney Kamlager, the Secretary of State Shirley Weber, all very prominent and very respected African-American office holders. It would have been very difficult for any one of them to accept the appointment, knowing that they could not run for re-election, and therefore trading away the remainder of their careers in public service for 1 year as a United States Senator. And so I think Newsom, knowing that there were any one of a number of women who could be very qualified senators, he picked the one who saved him politically. Because Butler, by not being a prior office holder, was not as certain to want to run for re-election. And again, as I said a moment ago, if she does decide to run, that's her call, not Newsom's, and the governor's off the hook. So we have another poll question for all of you on this. And I know we haven't talked about the rest of the race much beyond Butler's appointment, but I know you've all been following the Senate campaign because that's the kind of people we all are, because we care very deeply about who represents California and Washington and elsewhere. Given the fact that we have we'll say 3.5 candidates in the race right now, where do you think this race currently sits? Do you think Adam Schiff will be most likely to be elected to the Senate next year? Do you think Barbara Lee, even though not appointed by Newsom, she will continue in the race? Is she most likely to be our senator? Katie Porter, the Democratic representative from Orange County, will she win next year's election? Or will it be someone else? Either LaFonza Butler or someone who's not on that list of three. What do we all think? That is a very decisive response from our group. 83% believe that Adam Schiff will be the next senator from California. And I will say this, that while the polls currently show a very close race between Schiff and Porter, Schiff has opened up a very, very large lead in terms of fundraising. And while that isn't the only factor that will determine this race, it's certainly worth keeping in mind. And my guess is that in addition to the fundraising, many of those who said not that they preferred Schiff, but they thought he would win, are probably recognizing the very, very expansive public profile he developed during the Trump impeachments, when, of course, he led those proceedings on behalf of House Democrats. So very, very interesting results and very emphatic results. Now, what I see, Katie, what I see, Rachel, is we're already at the bottom of the hour. We haven't even touched on Hunter Biden and Donald Trump's trials. And what I'm hoping is that over the next 30 minutes, we get some questions on them. If not, let's just agree for now that this is a topic we'll come back to next month, unless even more seminal breaking news develops in the week before, in the days before we do our webinar. It seems like, doesn't it? It seems like every month we do this, some really big stuff happens, some really big news breaks right before we do this program. I guess that's the price of living in an interesting era. But maybe the thing to do now is, rather than trying to rush through such important topics, maybe we should go on to our group's questions. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that sounds like a good idea. They're a very curious audience, and they will never leave you short of questions. So let's start here. The Republicans seem to be floating the idea of making the former President Donald Trump the new speaker. Is that even possible? And what is the standing of that suggestion?
So technically speaking, and for those of you who have not seen the rumors, in addition to Steve Scalise and Jim Jordan and other House members, the rumor has been circulating for the past few days that perhaps the House would elect Donald Trump as the speaker. Now, to your question, Katie, or to the audience member's question, technically there is no rule, there is no requirement that the Speaker of the House be a member of the House, and no non-sitting House member has ever been elected to that position. But it's certainly legal, which means Trump could conceivably be elected as Speaker. That said, my own feeling is I think it is unlikely, because for someone already facing 4 criminal cases in court, and at the same time running a presidential campaign, the time that would be required to serve as Speaker in anything but the most ceremonial of ways, I think would be problematic for both Trump and for the House. I think even if Trump decided he were going to do it in simply a symbolic way and not really oversee the House of Representatives, but just take the title in order to bring the Republican Party together, I think those 18 Republican House members, those frontline Republicans who were elected in districts that voted for Joe Biden in 2020, I can't imagine them casting votes for Donald Trump for Speaker, and then the following year going back and facing the voters who'd supported Joe Biden. So it's the type of thing that's going to get a lot of very conservative Republicans extremely excited, but I think it's extremely, extremely improbable.
So our next audience member asked, will the Republicans' challenges in leadership impact the balance between them and Democrats in the election next year?
We don't know the answer to that. Many Democrats believe, and many Democratic members are already sending out fundraising appeals, essentially arguing that if the Republicans can't keep their own house in order, then how can they be trusted with running the country? A lot of Democrats running in the swing districts really do see this as an opportunity for them. And I think that's a plausible argument, but I'd also remind everyone that it's 13 months before the election. I think one of the things we've learned over the last several election cycles is so much happens over the course of a calendar year. It's difficult to predict how one single instance or one single event would cause a change like that in election results. What I can say is while we've never seen a speaker removed like this before, we have seen government shutdowns before when Congress was unable or unwilling to pass a budget. And so the question would logically be, does the majority party suffer when the government isn't able to pass a budget and there is a government shutdown? And the answer is more often than not, but that's not a certainty also. Because once again, between the time of an event and an election, there's no way to predict what else is going to impact voters' thinking. If the election were tomorrow, then there's no question that in my mind, that the removal of McCarthy would be of help to Democrats. But the election's a year from November, not tomorrow. So I think that while that's the case right now, it is difficult to see whether that'll maintain all the way through until next November.
And next up, if Donald Trump violates the judge's gag order, what can happen to him?
Okay. So in one of the four, actually that's not true. As I mentioned earlier, Trump is facing 4 criminal cases, but in addition, he's facing civil trials as well, including the one that's being heard in New York this week, where the state attorney general, Letitia James, has charged him and his business with fraud. And the judge in that case put a gag order, not just on Trump, but on all parties in the suit, although it was clearly directed at Trump after Trump had posted information regarding one of the judge's staffers on social media. So what we've seen since that judicial order is Trump has been more subdued. He'd originally planned on staying in New York for the entire week as the case progressed, but he returned to Mar-a-Lago yesterday. So it seems as if either Trump and or his advisors have realized that violating that order could cause him some very serious legal troubles. That said, between this case, several other civil trials, and 4 criminal trials, that's a lot of opportunity for Trump to want to be heard. And he understands that even if the cases are going in the wrong way for him, that these cases can still help him politically. That's why he was in the New York courtroom this week. So I think the temptation for him to speak out as aggressively as in the past is going to be palpable. And then if a former president violates this kind of court order, what does the judge do? Does the judge order him imprisoned? What other types of remedies can be offered? So at least this week, Trump decided to take a step back, but over the course of all of these trials, over the next year and longer, it's hard to see how he maintains that type of discipline. And it's impossible to predict how a judge would react if Trump did not adhere to their orders. So we don't know.
So sticking with our original topic for the night, but switching to the Biden side, how will the case against Hunter Biden directly impact President Biden?
Okay. Well, and we don't know the answer to that yet, but I would say that the most pronounced impact, at least as it relates to Joe Biden's reelection campaign, is that the fact that an investigation, not just the House hearings, but a judicial department investigation continues against Hunter Biden, the fact that that's going to continue almost certainly through the entire election year, if nothing else, muddies the waters for Trump and his allies. In other words, Trump is facing numerous court cases, as we've referenced today, and as we all know. But as long as Biden's son, even if it's not the president's son is in court, it makes it harder for Democrats to make as clear-cut an argument against Trump's legal challenges when Biden's son is facing some too. So the other way that the Hunter Biden case could affect Joe Biden, and I believe we talked about this briefly last month, is not as directly politically, but more personally. It's worth remembering that Joe Biden, as a very young man, even before he was sworn in the Senate, lost his first wife in a tragic car accident. And Hunter Biden and his brother Beau both survived. Beau Biden passed away tragically a few years back of brain cancer. As strong as a father and son bond is under any circumstances, it's reasonable to assume that for Joe Biden, his bond to his son, his surviving son, is even greater. And when the plea deal that was going to get Hunter off from the tax and gun charges that have been labeled against him, when that plea deal collapsed last summer, and it became apparent that these cases would likely continue through the election year, it's impossible to imagine how excruciating that must have been for President Biden. And as this case progresses, I think it's unlikely, but it's entirely possible for the president to decide the only reason my son is being put through all of this is because I'm president, and maybe continuing as president simply isn't worth it. That said, I think it's much more likely than not that Biden does continue to seek re-election, despite all the speculation about his health and age questions. But for a man who's so emotionally invested in his surviving son, watching these court proceedings take place has not just an extraordinary political impact, but I think even a more extraordinary personal and emotional impact. So if the question is, what is the effect on Biden? Well, the effect politically is it makes it harder for Democrats to criticize Trump in as clear-cut a way. The personal questions are much, much more difficult.
Okay, and following up on that, do you think that President Biden, if he runs, would pardon his son if he isn't reelected?
It's a great question, Katie, and there's no way to predict the answer to that. I feel like if Joe Biden were to seek re-election, he would not pardon Hunter. I know I get that right. But I could also see an incredible incentive on his part to pardon his son as part of or in the aftermath of his decision not to seek re-election. Once again, there's a lot of speculation about the president's health and about the president's age, but I think these types of questions are just as likely to impact his ultimate decision. And if he realized that he could pardon his son, even if it's by sacrificing a potential second term in office, I don't think that's the step that Joe Biden would take, but I wouldn't dismiss it either for all the reasons we've just been talking about.
So turning back to the House, we have a few more questions about that. This audience member asked, is there any chance the Problem Solvers Caucus of Republicans will cross the aisle to vote for Hakeem Jeffries for Speaker?
I think it's possible. It's not probable, but it's possible. Just to clarify, the Problem Solvers Caucus is a bipartisan caucus made up of of a relatively equal amount of Democrats and Republicans. So the Republican members of this bipartisan caucus, as I said earlier, tried to convince some of their Democratic colleagues to support McCarthy in order to avoid what they believed would be an even more conservative alternative. My guess is the fact that the Democrats rebuffed that offer would make it much more difficult for a large number of Republican problem solvers to now turn around and vote for Jeffries. It appears that the Republican frontliners, problem-solving caucus members, were really stung by their colleagues' refusal to even consider voting for McCarthy. That may have left some pretty bruised feelings. And so while it's not impossible, it's more likely than not that these Republicans hold firm within their party. I think the only thing that would tempt them to change their mind is that if they felt that the Republican alternatives for Speaker were so unacceptable, both philosophically and politically, they had no other choice. But that seems like pretty much of a long shot, at least today. But by next Wednesday, They could be thinking in an entirely different direction.
And another question about next Wednesday. Do you think it's possible for the Republican caucus to try to save face next week on Wednesday by electing a speaker?
They'll almost certainly try. They recognize that not only is this a great embarrassment, but it creates a real peril for the country and the various things our government needs to do in order to function. So I believe that there will be a tremendous incentive on their part to try to resolve this. And the effort and the willingness is the first step, but it's only the first step because, as we talked about earlier, there are still such deep-seated ideological and political divisions within the caucus that for a House member to put together not just a majority, but an almost unanimous majority of such a far-flung House caucus, it's doable by next Wednesday, but it's not going to be easy. So yes, they want to save the face. Yes, they do want to have a new speaker in place. The question isn't want, the question is will.
So switching gears back to California and the Senate race this year, this audience member said, "My question is based from the perspective that as a senior, I have believed that our representatives are simply too old and we need leadership from a younger generation. As California often leads the nation, do you think that our shift to a younger group of leaders will influence and lead a national trend?"
I suspect that it will. Well, actually, let me rephrase that. I think we will see the trend taking place in California, this generational shift. I think we'll see that reflected in national politics, probably about 4 years from now. But I don't think that's because of California's change of direction. I think it's because of the same underlying challenge that we've seen in both state and national politics. In other words, I can't imagine masses of voters in 49 other states saying, well, Californians turn to younger politicians, let's do the same thing. But the same concerns that Californians had that made them decide, okay, it is time now to turn the page. I think we'll see that at the national level to an even greater degree in 2028. Keep in mind that this is the third time in a row that Donald Trump has been his party's nominee for president. That hasn't happened since Franklin Delano Roosevelt. This is the second time in a row that Joe Biden's been his party's nominee for president. And I offer the obvious provisos, one or both of them could lose their nominations. But at this point, it looks like Trump will be nominated for the third time and Biden will be nominated for the second time. We haven't had a rematch, if you will, between the same two candidates for president since 1956, when Adlai Stevenson decided to challenge Dwight Eisenhower again. So in addition to the chronological age of so many of our nation's leaders, the fact that the same ones will have dominated the national political landscape for such a long period of time, I think by 2028 is going to create an even greater hunger for generational change at the national level than we've seen in California.
Okay, so moving on a bit, because multiple audience members were asking basically this same question. So LaFonza Butler lives in Maryland. Is it unusual to appoint a candidate to be a California senator who does not live nor vote in California?
Okay. So it's not, there's no law against a governor appointing someone who isn't a resident of the state, but no senator can serve, and for that matter, no House member can serve unless they're a resident of the state. So between Sunday night, when it became known that Newsom was going to appoint Butler, between Sunday night and Tuesday, when Vice President Harris swore in Butler as a senator, she changed her registration from Maryland to California. Now, in fairness to the new senator, she was a California resident and voter for over a decade before she moved to Maryland to take this job with Emily's List. So it's not as if she's becoming a resident here for the first time. And so what I'd say is that although it raised some eyebrows, the fact that Butler had lived here for several years before changing her residency to Maryland is probably going to keep this from being too big of an issue. If she'd never been here before, one thing, but the 2-year absence doesn't seem to have upset too many people.
So our next question is a bit outside of the topics that we've discussed tonight, but they asked, unless new evidence is exposed, it's unlikely that the president will be removed, even though he may well be impeached. What impact will this have?
I think Biden will almost certainly be impeached. And unless evidence does emerge that has not to date, he will not be removed from office. But what does that mean? That means that for the first 220 plus years of our republic, we had one single impeachment of a president. In the last 5 years, we've had 3. And so I wonder if the electorate is getting a bit deadened to all this. Who knows, someday there might be a trivia question. Who were the last, George W. Bush, could be a Jeopardy question. George W. Bush and Barack Obama. The question can be, who are the last 2 American presidents who weren't impeached? Maybe this just becomes something that happens under every presidency, at least every presidency where the other party controls the House of Representatives. But unlike a Nixon impeachment, had it occurred before he resigned from office, in which you had sizable numbers of swing voters being affected by what they were seeing and hearing, I believe a Biden impeachment, should it come to pass, will serve as an additional motivator for both loyal Republicans and loyal Democrats. But I can't imagine it changing many votes at all. Again, I think we're just getting somewhat deadened to it at this point. And my fear is that the process becomes so devalued going forward because it becomes so frequently used.
Very interesting. Thank you. There has been some reporting that Robert Kennedy will drop out of the Democratic race and run as an independent. What is the likelihood of this happening? And if he does this, what would the impact be for the traditional parties?
Well, Kennedy has scheduled an announcement for next week in which he's going to talk about his plans going forward. And he has been increasingly forceful in his criticism of the Democratic Party, of the Democratic National Committee, because of the way he believes that have favored Biden at his expense. And so the rumors are rampant, and he hasn't done much to dispel them, that he will announce that he's running as an independent instead of as a Democrat. The challenge there is that qualifying for the ballot as an independent candidate, as opposed to as a member of a political party, is an incredibly expensive and incredibly time-consuming process. And so while it's entirely possible that Kennedy could qualify for the ballot in many states, it's a much more difficult road for him than simply saying, okay, now I'm an independent, and being a challenge going forward. Now, we've seen polls that offer differing results on whether he hurts Trump or Biden more. It's reasonable to assume that as a fellow Democrat, if Kennedy was the third candidate, it would cost Biden more votes. But hypothetical polls show it's not that clear. The other potential challenge for Kennedy is Professor Cornel West, who up until now has been running as the Green Party candidate for president, announced just today that he will run not as a Green Party member, but as an independent. So like Kennedy, it's going to be pretty hard for West to qualify for the ballots in a large number of states. But it's going to be even harder if there are 2 prominent independents. Because without getting too far down in the weeds, the way a candidate who's not affiliated with the party gets on a state ballot for president is by turning in a certain number of signatures, petitions showing that X number of thousands of voters in that particular state want them on the ballot. Well, in almost every state that allows this process, they only allow a voter to sign that petition for one independent candidate. So if Kennedy and West were both running, not only would it be expensive, not only would it be time consuming, but they'd be competing against each other for ballot access in most states. And that doesn't sound like a recipe for success for either one of them.
So I want to finish up with this question. How can the House change the one-person rule calling for removal of the Speaker? And is that something they would do?
Well, it's not that hard to change. All they need is a majority vote, and they changed the rule previously, and they can change it back. The question isn't whether they can, but whether they will. It appears right now that a large majority of Republicans are so angry at Matt Gaetz and his allies that they will want to change the rule back. But that's the type of decision that could get them crossways with the most conservative voters in their own districts. So I think while it's more likely than not, the majority of the House will decide that changing this rule is in the interest of the House, not to benefit either party, but just so a speaker can oversee the House without every day worrying about whether they might be removed from office or not. I think there's a pretty strong majority for that sentiment right now. I wouldn't predict it necessarily happening, given the potential conservative backlash that could occur if the vote does take place. So if this were a secret ballot, it would pass with over 400 votes out of 435. But it's a public ballot, and that's where it gets more complicated.
Well, thank you so much, Dan. We always appreciate your analysis. And thank you also to our audience. We had so many questions this session. So if yours wasn't answered, hopefully we'll get to it on our Continuing the Conversation segment this month.
Yeah, and Rachel and I, as always, will try to answer a few more questions than the ones that we got to tonight. And I also, not only do I want to thank all of you for being here, but I want to thank all of you for your patience. I know that many of you tuned in expecting a conversation about Donald Trump and Hunter Biden's various courtroom challenges. And that is a topic we'll get back to. But I hope you'd all understand and agree that given the news that's broken over the last several days, that it did make sense for us to make somewhat of an adjustment for tonight's program. And of course, as always, Rachel and Katie, you're both terrific. Thank you so much for everything you did to make this program such a success. And I will see both of you and many of our members in the after the webinar program in just a few minutes, right?
Yes, yeah, which we're looking forward to. If you're a member and you'd like to join us, email Katie or I, and we'll get you the link to that program. And we hope to see you at one of our other upcoming programs this month as well. So we hope you'll join us for 2 special programs in October in partnership with Loyola Marymount University. First, on October 10th, we host a screening of the film Freedom on Fire, Ukraine's Fight for Freedom, with filmmaker Yevgeny Afanyevsky, which will be moderated by our board member, Kevin Getz. Then on October 19th, join us for a panel conversation titled X, Y, Z, and Boomers Too, The Generations in the U.S. Economy. Then on October 25th, join us for a live stream with author Ian Johnson on his new book, which is titled Sparks, China's Underground Historians and Their Battle for the Future. And then, of course, we'll be back here with Dan on November 9th. So we'll look forward to seeing you all then. Be sure to visit our website for more programs and have a great night.
Thanks so much, everyone.